just about the only thing standing between you and your lunch, so I will try to be fairly brief. This is joint work with Rasha Ramadan, who's sitting here next to me, who's at the University of CAIRO and also an ERF affiliate, if I'm not mistaken. I'm from the University of Paris South, which is changing names, by the way, but that's a whole different story. So I'm going to present to you a paper on migration and inequalities, where we've chosen to study 4 countries around the Mediterranean, Spain, Italy, Jordan, and Iraq. Okay. So first of all, both migration and inequalities are much talked about subjects in current state of affairs. Migration is something like some kind of a hot potato in politics right now. You all know what Trump has been promising and has been starting to do and has not been starting to do. The EU is in quite intense negotiations with Turkey regarding how many, the future of the refugees that Turkey is currently hosting. So it's used as a political tool, and in national discourses it's also being blamed for a whole lot of things, such as increasing unemployment, the disappearance of the national state, all the way to terrorism. But you know that. Inequalities have also received a lot of attention in recent years with several high-profile books, Piketty, Atkinson, Milanovic, etc., which I guess you can think that this interest is sparked by the recognition that inequalities lead to severe problems, social problems. And that's probably part of why we've become more and more interested in the topic. The links between migration and inequalities aren't new. Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal actually talked about this in 1957 in a book about economic underdevelopment. So there's been a theoretical thought, there's been a theoretical analysis surrounding this for a long time. However, theory doesn't go very far in giving us good predictions as for the relationship between migration and inequalities. There are a number of trade-offs involved, so we argue at least that this is a question which is best answered empirically. Okay. This seminar is called Inequality around the Mediterranean, so we're picking 4 countries around the Mediterranean, not only because of that, but also because migration around the Mediterranean is historically important. It's important in the recent years as well. You've got huge economic migration to countries such as Spain over the last 2 decades. There's a lot of refugee flows as well, the Syrian crisis, what's happening in Libya, etc. So what we're interested in is 2 things. First, how do variations in the size of the immigrant stock impact inequalities in Spain and Italy? And then how do variations in emigration, which we capture with remittances, we're only focusing on the remittance channel, impact inequalities in the 2 countries of Jordan and Iraq? So first, why would migration have an impact on inequalities? There are a number of reasons. First of all, migrants are usually not random. It's not a random sample of the population. When they come, they modify the relative factor stocks. Okay? First of all, they increase the share of labor to capital in their country of arrival, and they probably increase the shares of unqualified or relatively unqualified work with respect to qualified work, depending on which flows you look at and which country pairs you look at. So this should modify factor prices, relative wages. It should modify them if natives and foreigners are substitutes, okay? Because then employers would go on and hire usually cheaper foreigners, and there'd be competition driving the wage down. If they're complements, which is a different theory and probably less true, then it should only increase unemployment. But this factor model is very insufficient because we're ignoring all the general equilibrium effects. Okay? We're ignoring the fact that migrants come not only as supply of labor, but also as consumers, as demand. So there's a demand shock that can only be captured with a general equilibrium framework. We also know that there are trade effects. When there's a larger bilateral flow between 2 countries, trade tends to increase, business partnerships are formed, etc. And finally, there can be structural change if migrants bring with them different consumption patterns, modifying the overall consumption pattern of the country, and this leads to structural change, which can modify income distributions as well. And of course, when you include remittances into the analysis and you look at inequalities post-transfers, there's also an effect of remittances. So to study this, which to be honest has mostly been looked at in terms of labor and wages, the impact of migration on wages, there are several angles of attack. The first one and the most cited, most credible one, if you want, is the natural experiment angle of attack, which is the most famous one is Card's paper on the Marielitos, the Cubans who came in the 1980s to Miami and increased the share of the labor force by 7%. He finds basically no impact on wages. This has then been criticized by Borges, etc., and the debate is sort of ongoing, but this is one angle of attack. Another one is to assume an aggregate production function. Okay, so we're assuming a nested production structure with different elasticities between natives and foreigners, between skilled and unskilled, that are estimated from the data. Okay, so if once these elasticities are estimated, you can run counterfactual experiments, look at what would the arrival of, say, 1 million foreigners do to my relative wage. And then there's the most common method, which is probably the spatial correlations method, where we just compare across different geographical units, such as cities, the share of migrants and wages. So this is something that Card did, for example, in a 2009 paper for US cities. The problem with this method is that it might include an adjustment bias, which is due to the fact that when there's more migrants in a city, locals might adjust. If there's a depressing wage effect of the arrival of migrants, some locals might move, and they would thus induce a bias into the wage effect. Card argues this bias is not very important, shows that for US data, it's, whether you include it or account for it or not, the results are consistent. In terms of emigration is also something that brings about modifications in factor proportions. It has been much less studied. Firstly, when a large share of the population leaves the country, that modifies the capital labor proportion. And also, of course, if these people send remittances back and they're not random, then that can have effects on the income distribution. And one of the first and most important studies is the one by Mishra, showing that emigration from Mexico over 3 decades has contributed to a rise in Mexican wages of 8%. Okay. As to the direct studies of remittances, there are a number of them. They haven't found one conclusive result. There's been inequality increasing results that's been found, and also inequality decreasing results. And the net effect is probably country specific and probably depends on the way migrants are selected from their origin country, from the upper parts of the income distribution or from the lower parts. Okay, so as I said, we have 2 separate parts in the paper. First, we look at the impact of immigration on inequalities in 2 southern European countries, Spain and Italy, using the spatial correlations approach. And then we look briefly at the impact of remittances on inequalities in 2 other Mediterranean MENA countries, Jordan and Iraq, where we use a quantile regression. So first, a little bit of context for Spain and Italy for the first part. Spain is a new immigration country. In 1995 or 1998 or so, the share of foreign-born in Spain was about 1%. In 2013 or so, it was 12%. So that's a huge increase over 10, 15 years. So it's an interesting case. The most common foreigners you'll find in Spain are Moroccans, South Americans, Ecuador, Colombia, etc., and also people from East Europe, Romania, but also to some extent Albania and Moldova. We use 5 data sets from the list data here, the 5 latest surveys. You can see here we've computed Gini's, the share of migrants, and the average household income per capita for these different waves. And the Gini in Spain has been increasing, computed from the list data, as has the share of migrant households. So just to be clear, we work at a household level, and we consider a migrant household to be a household run by with a head who was born abroad. Okay, so with these surveys, we compute a panel For each region, we have a region year panel, so we'll have about 20 regions and 5 years. So about 100 observations, a little bit less. In Italy, unfortunately, the list data doesn't contain any information of the country of origin of migrants, so we only know how many migrants there are in total. We know from other sources that Eastern Europe is very prevalent origin. Romanians, Albanians constitute about a third of foreigners in Italy. We know in Italy, we know also that migrants are less educated than natives, slightly, but they're more often employed than natives. And interestingly, when you look at Italy, the Gini has been going down. If you look at the LIS data, if you compute it for the 5 last surveys, while the share of migrant households has been going up. Okay, so a little bit different picture from Spain. Okay, so our dependent variable here is average household per capita income. Okay, households where the head is a foreigner, as I said, are classified as immigrant households. We use fixed effects and random effects models in the first step. One issue is that there is no information on remittances in these surveys. The variable is there, but it's empty. So we're saying that our results are focusing on net disposable income pre-remittances, and would probably see even stronger effects, even more inequality, effects on inequality if we could somehow include remittances and look at the income post-remittances. Okay, so here are 2 random effects and a fixed effect model for Spain. The dependent variable here is the Gini index, okay, Gini coefficient. So as you can see, the share of migrant households is positively related to the Gini. When this share increases by 1%, Gini would go up by 0.2% in the random effects model. About half of that in the fixed effects model, but it's not significant. Similar results when you look at the ratio P90 over P10. You see an important effect of the share of migrant households in the random effect models. In the fixed effect model, the coefficient's positive, but not significant. And when looking at P10 over P50, so this would be the share of the 10th percentile over the share of the 50th percentile, there's a negative effect, also consistent with inequalities increasing. And this one's significant, albeit only at the 10% level in the fixed effect model, in both models, suggesting quite a strong effect. For Italy, qualitatively, the results are about the same. We see an effect of about 0.1 to 0.2, not significant though. This is probably due to the fact that we're using a panel of region years, which gives us about 100 observations. With a fixed effect, it's very difficult to get something significant out of that. We do find something for P90 over P10 though. Again, it's in the same ballpark as the Spanish result. Also shows inequality increasing with immigration. And results are again negative and significant for the P10 over P50 for Italy. Okay, so there's a positive coefficient on the Gini, but it's only significant in the Spain random effects model. The other 2 measures are more often significant, but not always. Of course, endogeneity is a cause for concern here. Although we use a fixed effect model sometimes, this doesn't sufficiently capture all the endogeneity that could be there. Most notably, if a change in the income distribution would spur migration to a specific region, there's a problem. So we use the traditional shift share instrument from the literature on migration and wage impacts, which is essentially that we're computing for each origin country its share by region in the population. And we multiply that with the total flow of individuals from that country of origin in between 2 waves. And we divide that by the population share of the region that interests us. So that gets us a kind of a shift share instrument. We get information about these different flows from a municipal registry in Spain, which has information on the birth of every citizen of Spain, the birth country of every citizen of Spain. Okay, so when we do that, we still don't find any effect of the Gini. The coefficients is about the same size as before, however. For the P10 to P50 and P90 to P10, we do find significant effects, inequality increasing effects. So it seems that if there's something going on here between migration and inequalities, it's happening in the tails. Okay, it's happening most probably at the bottom of the distribution. So we try to distinguish different origins of migrants to see if migrants from different regions have different impacts. Now this is of course very, very difficult to do given the size of our panel, which is about 100 observations. We try it anyways, distinguish migrants into 5 groups: Africans, Americans, Western Europeans, Eastern Europeans, and Asians. Almost nothing comes out significant, except for the fact that Asian migrants, who are mainly from Bangladesh and India, do contribute positively to Gini in both specifications. Also, we find that African migrants contribute negatively to P10 to P50 in the random effects model. But as I said again, the number of observation makes it difficult to give it a meaningful interpretation, so we should be cautious probably. So this has been focusing on the within-region inequalities. It would be interesting to know if there's a between-region inequality as well, so if the distributions are moving away from each other in regions that receive a lot and not so many migrants. So we do the decomposition, which was said this morning, with a mean logarithmic deviation, since the Gini cannot be decomposed into a within and a between component. In all cases, we see that the majority of inequality is being accounted for within regions, which is perhaps not so surprising, given that we're working on one single country, one single economy. If there were major differences between region, population movements would probably quite quickly make them disappear. Okay, so if in any case there was a between-region inequality, we would probably capture that by regressing what we just did on the mean wage by region. So we do that and we don't find any kind of effect. So I now turn to remittances and inequalities in Jordan and Iraq. Since what we're interested here, and along with previous literature, is the distribution of incomes and the impact along different percentiles of the distribution, we use a quantile regression. And we want to know what the income impact of remittances is at various percentiles in the income distribution. The problem, of course, is that receiving remittances is not a random event, neither in Iraq, neither in Jordan. So we're trying, and this is where we probably also need to do more work, to instrument using the Chernzhukov and Hansen IV quantile regression technique. But I can tell you already that when we do this instrumentation, we don't find any meaningful results, and the fit of the model is very poor. So we probably need to rework this, and your input will be very much appreciated. Without the IV, however, we do find some interesting effects. First, let me give you a few words about the context. Iraq has a positive, but very low net migration rate, okay, at 2.7. So about the same number of people leaving or entering, roughly. Very few households in Iraq receive remittances, about 1% of Iraqi households, mainly urban ones. And this amounts to about 0.3% of GDP. Jordan has a much larger crude net migration rate at 11.2. Part of this is explained by the Syrian crisis. Remittances are much more common in Jordan, 11.7% of GDP in 2013, and that's about 6% of households. So here, unfortunately, the whole table couldn't fit, so there's one coefficient missing. The interesting line is the first one, which gives you the effect of receiving remittances at different quantiles, at different percentiles in the income distribution. So as you can see, and this trend goes on, there is an increasing effect. Okay, so receiving remittances in the 9th decile, so at the 90th percentile, increases your income by a larger percentage than if you receive remittances in the 10th percentile, at the 10th percentile, which means that remittances are inequality increasing. So let me show you the results for Iraq briefly as well. Again, the last coefficient is missing, but we find the same pattern. Coefficients are a little bit larger. Again, those at the bottom of the distribution see an effect of receiving remittances that is much lower than those who are at the percentage-wise than those who are at the top of the distribution. Okay, so as I already mentioned to you, we're trying to treat the endogeneity here with an IV approach. In the literature, a classic IV for this would be using the number of bank branches by the level of the governorate in Iraq and Jordan as an instrument. As I also told you, at the moment we're still working on better modeling this because the results aren't significant, but worse than that, the model isn't very good, isn't very well fit. So to conclude, we show some evidence, albeit not very strong, that regions in Spain and Italy which receive more migrants than others develop higher inequalities. It seems to be driven by the low incomes at the bottom of the distribution. Our ratios, P10 to P50 and P90 to P10, are much more often significant than the Gini coefficient. As for the remittances to Jordan and Iraq, their impact seems to be inequality increasing, since higher earning households have a larger percentage effect of receiving remittances. And we still have a couple of things to deal with in this paper. We need to account for the inequality effects of emigration as well, if you want to paint a complete picture of the role of immigrants and income distributions. Something along the lines of Mishra, showing that the fact that emigration occurs means that the shares of labor and capital are modified, and this has direct impacts on the wage distribution. We could also simulate the effects of various immigration scenarios after this on the income distribution, and perhaps include in the paper a light general equilibrium framework to discuss the different mechanisms at play. So thank you. That's all.